Hey YouTube, welcome to the first Cloud in a Hurry video. These videos are designed to give you the latest in news in the cloud space. Today I'm taking a look at the AWS Weekly Roundup. This blog post, it's an AWS blog post. They released a blog post yesterday. The blog post is a roll-up of a bunch of other blog posts, and I was just scanning it, looking through it myself, and thought, hey, maybe make a video about this. There are a couple of really interesting things on this roll up that I thought may really capture the attention of folks who use AWS. So I thought I would put a video together. So I'm just going to scroll through this. This is using like a reader extension. Um, there's a ton of announcements on here. The highlighted ones are the ones that I thought were personally interesting, and those are the ones that we're going to talk about. So the first one on the list is AWS Step Functions adds integration for 33 services, including Amazon Q. If you have never used Step Functions, it is a really interesting orchestration service that's built into AWS. It's a standalone service that allows you to integrate things like, um, I guess the main integration is built around Lambda, so you can orchestrate Lambda functions to produce an output, take an output, um, you know, react in different ways based on output. So if you have a maybe a good maybe good or bad, depending on how you look at it. Example, this would be an ETL flow. So there are obviously other services that address ETL flows in AWS, Glue being one of them. But let's just pretend for a second like some of those other services didn't exist. So you want to build your own bespoke ETL workflow using Lambda functions. So, there are multiple steps in that workflow. And depending on what happens in one stage of a workflow, maybe you want to do some alternative processing versus like if you had a failure, you would just send a notification to somebody and that's the end of your process. Step functions let you kind of orchestrate those types of workflows. So it's kind of this glue between different parts of AWS. So this is a big deal. Step functions is, I'm honestly not even sure like what services they were integrated with previously prior to this announcement of the 33 additional services, other than Lambda. Lambda is the big one. The other one that I know for sure that they supported was the deployment of like Kubernetes jobs in EKS clusters, which is actually a really big feature that doesn't get talked about a lot. There are so many different like open source orchestration tools that are built literally for Kubernetes. I think of things like Volcano and things like that. But sometimes the integration between what lives outside of Kubernetes and your AWS account kind of gets lost with tools like that. So Step function is actually a really neat way to kind of stitch orchestration between, your AWS account, resources in that account, and even things inside of Kubernetes. So if you've never taken a look at step functions, take a look at it. It is a really neat service. The orchestration of step functions itself is really simple. You basically just have like JSON task definitions that can be written. I'm pretty sure you can orchestrate it with CloudFormation. There's definitely an orchestration capability built into Terraform for step functions. So the other thing that I wanted to do was figure out what the actual 33 additional services were. I pulled up the GitHub page for Bado 3 and went through and started looking at some of the most recent releases, and I couldn't find anything. If I figure out what those 33 additional services are and what the actual integration points are with step functions, I'll make a follow-up video to this, or I'll post a comment on the video. So the next one is ECS Service Connect. So once again, I'm going to bring up Kubernetes because this is kind of an analogous situation to if you need to do pod to pod or service to service TLS encryption. Typically, the way you've done that in Kubernetes is to stand up a service mesh. So something like Linkerd, something like Istio. Most of those come with the capability to do MTLS between two different workloads running in the same cluster, even if they're in different namespaces. So this is really huge. Really, Kubernetes is great. There are tons of different, you know, places I've worked at where like Kubernetes was just overkill, and ECS is a great, I don't want to deal with the complexity of Kubernetes because I don't need all the bells and whistles. I don't need everything that it offers, but I still need some way to easily deploy and manage container-based workloads. So ECS is great for that. The ability to just add automatic encryption between, different services running in ECS by a literal integration with, you know, just inbuilt AWS services. Like, I mean, this is huge. So if you have compliance, there are certain compliances or, security um, programs or protocols where, doing encryption between workloads, even inside of your own infrastructure, is a requirement. And like you can basically get it, I don't know what the exact mechanism to set this up is. I can't imagine it's like super complicated to do this. You're probably using like AWS Private Certificate Authority or something to emit your certificates, and then you just point ECS at that certificate authority and tell it, hey, get tickets from the CA and secure the communication from service to service with those certificates. So this is huge. Like this is the type of thing that's a lot of work to set up, especially if you had to do it in ECS. Like it's a lot of work to do in Kubernetes, but there are tools like literal tools, service meshes, things like that make it kind of easy to do this. The other way that you could have done this before is to, point your microservices at a Vault installation, like a HashiCorp Vault installation. It has a CA feature. You can ingest those certificates and, basically pull them into the container at runtime and do your TLS encryption that way. There are other ways you can do it too. You can just mint your own private certificates with something like MakeCert, like things like that. But this is huge, and I really can't overstate the importance of this sort of thing if you're in one of those situations where you have to build service to service encryption into your microservices stack. So if you're an ECS user and you're doing this some other way, take a look at this because it's probably going to be a lot easier than what you're currently doing to do that TLS communication inside your cluster. So bunch of other stuff going on here. Not going to talk about all these, but read up. I guess maybe one thing if you're in Tokyo region, M7 R7A instances are available. So move up to the new instance class because they're going to be cheaper likely than the R6A and M6A instances that you're using now. Usually the newer classes are cheaper than the older ones. So take a look at that. So this is big. Export a software bill of materials using Amazon Inspect. This is huge. So if you're in the software development space, if you work at a SaaS company, if you do due diligence for, as part of a security team, um, for procurement for your company, like I know that, there are a lot of the Fortune 1 500 companies. Like when you are procured, your product is procured as part of their procurement process. They're asking for SBOMs now, or there's language in contract saying, within X number of months of us signing a good contract with you to use your product, you will provide us with an SBOM. So SBOMs are not going anywhere. They're here to stay. I think you will see over the next several months like a continued profusion of people asking and providing them in the SaaS space. So if you don't know what they are, go do some research and understand like what an SBOM is. Essentially, it is a software bill of materials. That's what the name is, right? It's a list of all the packages that your software uses. So if you're a Python, or we'll take Python and Node.js because they're kind of similar in how they do dependency management. I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of like there are 15,000 different tools, but we'll just take the simplest ones like pip and npm. If I'm writing a piece of Python software and I need a third party dependency to write that software, so like if I'm writing something for AWS, I would use Bado 3, pip install Bado 3. Well, Bado 3 depends on Bado core. Bado 3 depends on probably other. I know it depends on other libraries. I'm not sure what they are, but it's basically one of these things where I have a dependency that has a dependency that has a dependency. So you resolve these dependency trees, you have all the software installed on your local machine. And SBOM is basically just a text defined file that says like these are all of the dependencies. So, your software uses Bado 3, your software uses Bado core, your software uses probably URL lib, right, to make requests. And the same thing like with a Node.js package, npm install something. Like what part of the magic of what npm does is taking the thing that you asked for and finding all of its dependencies and all its dependencies and basically making sure that everything on your local laptop can run the piece of software that you've just written, assuming that you're using this third-party library. So, depending on how you package up and ship your software, you're probably putting that stuff in a Docker container or whatever the thing is. But an SBOM is a manifest that defines what your software is using is dependencies to actually run your service. So these things are big. They're definitely just like you're just going to continue to see them like the government through SSDA and SSDF. Like you're going to begin to see, these absolutely inserted into contract language if you are being procured by the government. So if you're not already producing SBOMs as part of your software build processes like your CI processes, there are definitely tools that can already do this. You can have inspector do it for you. And maybe, if you're in a place where you're using can use inspector or are using inspector, it's always good to run these sorts of tools once things are deployed in your environment, right? Because, there are opportunities for things to be added to software that you may not know about, outside of a CI process. Hopefully not. Like, hopefully you have a good security process where you know that the software you're deploying is the software you built. But a belt and suspenders check, turn something like this on if it's available to you. So this does support the Cyclone DX and the SPDX formats, which are kind of the two prevailing, commonly used formats for sharing S-bombs. And I did pull up the page here. This is the actual blog post that's referenced from the roundup. And it is really interesting because it does talk a little bit about, it walks you through like what the actual configuration of this looks like. The other thing that was kind of interesting about this to me that, I didn't like plan on seeing when I came and looked at this post was that you can encrypt the SBOM report. In fact, like it requires you to encrypt the SBOM report with a KMS key. So this is actually really interesting. I understand like, giving somebody the option to do this, but, forcing somebody to do this, it's truly an interesting thing. And I think it's a really nice thing that Amazon is kind of nodding their head towards here. And that, these S-bombs they're sensitive company documents. So I think forcing somebody to encrypt them as part of setting them up is actually pretty interesting. And then, depending on your key policy, you could, add permissions with a third party organization, your auditing organization, whatever that is, to actually be able to view these documents. So it's pretty cool. I would like to see how this integrates because, as I've mentioned before, the main point at which you would use inspector is directly on EC2 instances. So I am curious to see if this can integrate with containerized workloads. So as I said, I'll perhaps do a little bit more digging and even make a follow-up video where we kind of look at this in depth because I'd really like to see how this works. So that is my quick takes from the AWS Weekly Roundup from the 29th. So that's yesterday. Thanks for joining. And if you found this interesting, let me know in the comments. I would like to perhaps roll this out to other cloud vendors. So looking at things like GCP, Azure, and maybe even OCI. If people find this sort of content valuable, I'll keep doing it for AWS because the pace of innovation at AWS, it's just impossible to keep up with it. Like you can't go read these yourself. And if you don't like the things that I find interesting, I guess maybe you have to go read it yourself. But if I miss something in this roundup that you thought was really interesting, you thought, man, I wish you would have talked about that a little bit, let me know, and I'll try to make sure that we cover the high points for all of our viewers. Thanks a lot.